You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, I'm coming to you live from Chicago at the DNC. We have some news here regarding Alvin Bragg and Donald Trump's sentencing in New York. Some what may be perceived as not so great news on the surface. Can you explain what just happened here?
Yeah, I think the prospect of Donald Trump being sentenced on September 18th just got a little bit dimmer, Brian. And, you know, if our viewers feel like every time we get close to Donald Trump being held accountable for just some of his crimes, we have the justice rug pulled out from under us, you know, I'm with you in that feeling. So here's what happened. Donald Trump filed a letter motion with the court a couple of days ago saying, Judge, we understand you're going to rule on the presidential immunity issue as it applies to my New York guilty verdicts on September 16th, and that you presently intend to sentence me on September 18th. However, we're putting you on notice that if you deny our motion to dismiss, you claim I don't have presidential immunity from prosecution in the New York case, I will immediately appeal it to both state appellate courts and federal appellate courts. Now, it's an open question whether he has an immediate right to appeal, and if so, in what court, but let's set all that aside. So in response to that motion, that threat basically to immediately appeal on the 16th, Alvin Bragg's prosecutors just responded. And they said, Judge Merchan, I'll tell you what, we are going to defer to the court on whether you should keep Donald Trump's September 18th sentencing date in place or cancel it and push it further down the road. Because look, Judge, he said he's going to appeal. And what that means is it will almost certainly necessitate a delay in his September 18th trial date. And what they do, Brian, at the very end of this 1.5-page letter motion that they just filed with Judge Merchan, they said, look, we don't believe he necessarily has this right to immediately appeal, but this will become a logistical nightmare because anytime the president, former president, comes to town, comes to the courthouse, everything else has to stop. It's extremely disruptive. Multiple police agencies are involved. They have to coordinate, and things tend to shut down. And they say what we don't want to have happen is putting all of those pieces in place for September 18th, only to have him derail the sentencing date by filing all of these emergency appeals, which even if not meritorious, not successful, not winning appeals, will probably result in some delay of that September 18th trial date. So they ultimately didn't take a position. They didn't say, we object and we insist that you keep the sentencing date set for September 18th. They didn't say, we agree with the defense, with Donald Trump, and we want you to push the sentencing date down the road. They said simply, Your Honor, we defer to the court. Now, let me tell you, Brian, people see that, you know, since when does a prosecution defer to the court, defer to the judge? Isn't the prosecutor supposed to take a position?
That's actually the question that I had here, because the prosecutor worked so hard to secure all of these convictions. He won these convictions, and so shouldn't he, of all people, be the first one to say, no, we're gonna, you know, my position here is that he should be sentenced on September 18th. We worked hard to secure these convictions. Why would I want to defer to the court when my position should be the most aggressive of everybody out here?
Brian, that's a great point. I think we can fairly ask, why would the prosecutors throw up their hands now and say, we defer to the court? Because listen, we are all thirsty for justice. Donald Trump has been convicted of 34 felonies by a jury of his peers for interfering in the 2016 election, cheating to try to steal that election. Let's get this mope sentenced. But the prosecutors threw up their hands. Here's why that's not unusual. So in similar circumstances, Brian, on procedural matters, let me give you an example. I would be in court after a conviction was handed down by the jury, and the defense might say, Your Honor, the defense is available for a sentencing date on September 1st, September 15th, and September 30th. You know what I would say? I would say, Your Honor, the prosecution, the government, defers to the court. I'm available on all of those dates. Now, there's not a lot riding on it in the hypothetical I just laid out, but here is what Alvin Bragg's prosecutors believed. I think they believe it's a foregone conclusion that if Judge Merchan rules against Donald Trump on September 16th, when he's already announced he will hand down his immunity ruling, and Donald Trump starts filing these appeals, even if they're frivolous appeals, not winning appeals, the appeals court will almost certainly say, listen, we need some time with this. So what we're going to do is we're going to stay or pause the sentencing date for September 18th. And the prosecutors, as I mentioned, put in their letter, we don't want to move heaven and earth with all these law enforcement agencies and otherwise shut down the Manhattan courtroom and courthouse if Donald Trump is not going to be sentenced on the 18th. But like I say, it feels like, the justice wind being knocked out of us over and over again. But Brian, we're going to get up, we're going to keep fighting, and we're going to keep moving in the direction of Donald Trump being held accountable for his crimes.
Now, just to clarify here, this is us kind of discussing what would be the worst case scenario, because there still is the likelihood, even though Alvin Bragg is deferring to the court, that the court itself, that Judge Merchan himself may just say, no, I'm refusing, and that the New York appeals court and even the federal court system will both refuse to take up Donald Trump's appeal and will just proceed to sentencing on the 18th. Is that correct?
Yes. So just because the prosecutors deferred to the judge, that doesn't mean Judge Merchan will necessarily grant Trump's motion to vacate, that is, to cancel his September 18th trial date. Judge Merchan would be well within his right to say, all right, Mr. Prosecutor, I hear you. I appreciate your position. I appreciate that you are deferring to the court's discretion, but I'm telling you the September 18th trial date remains. But here's the thing, Brian. When Judge Merchan knows that means multiple law enforcement agencies and the Manhattan courthouse will have to move heaven and earth to make sure everything is in place for Donald Trump to be sentenced on September 18th, only to have these appeals put a stop to it, even if it's not a legitimate stop in the long run. If I had to lay my buck bet, I would say, you know what, Judge Merchan is probably going to say the more circumspect thing to do is hand down my ruling on the 16th, see if Donald Trump submits these appeals, and if the appeals court accepts the appeal, and then, you know what? If the appeals court rejects the appeal and says, no, this is not an immediately appealable issue, and it may not be, and Alvin Bragg's prosecutors put that suggestion in their 1.5-page response, then Judge Merchan can say, fine, we'll do it on September 25th, a week later. So, there's still a lot of moving pieces, and until we hear from Judge Merchan himself, we will not know if Donald Trump will be going to sentencing on September 18th or not.
Okay, and given this update, just to clarify here, because Alvin Bragg has decided to defer to the court in terms of whether the sentencing date should remain September 18th, where do you put the likelihood that Donald Trump is sentenced on September 18th today versus a few days ago, for example?
Yeah, I have less hope and optimism today than I did a couple of days ago that we will see Donald Trump finally sentenced for some of his crimes on September 18th. At this moment, if I was a Vegas odds maker, I would probably say there's about a 20 or 25% chance Donald Trump is going to be in that New York courtroom on September 18th, being sentenced for his 34 felony crimes.
Okay, well, obviously this is a very fluid, dynamic situation that's moving quickly, so we will stay on top of this. As soon as we have any updates, we'll bring them to you. So for those watching right now, if you want to stay on top of everything that's happening, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.